Hello, I'm Cath P, and today we're going to talk about insects. Most of us as children go through a bug period and get fascinated by all sorts of tiny creepy crawlies and have a pet snail and all that sort of thing. But quite often, as we get older, we sort of only notice insects when they're being a pest, unless we're really keen on that sort of thing. And we see butterflies and say, aren't they lovely? But we don't really look carefully at them. So today we're going to look at insects, why they're essential, what we can do for them, and what they do for us. 90% of all species of animal are insects. We've got 27,000 types of insect in the UK. Totally amazing. They're everywhere. Over 1 million species of insects have been described, discovered and named, but it's estimated there might be as many as 9 million out there. So some of them we don't even know about. 40% of them are beetles. Incredibly varied, all sorts of different beetles, from great big ones to little tiny ones. And it's worth stopping and just having a look at some of them because they are the most incredibly beautiful things. These ones look a little odd, but the metallic colours of them, the way they're put together, just stop and have a look at a beetle. There's probably 1.4 billion insects for every human being on the planet. What are you going to do with your 1.4 billion of them? The first thing you'd notice if you went out and lay on your nose on the ground, the first insect to come along would probably be an ant. The world is covered in ants, loads of different sorts of ants. They're absolutely amazing. If you've got one of those old-fashioned beam balances that has a pan on each side, and you put all the ants in the world in one of the pans, and then you put all the people in the world in the other, the ants would weigh about the same as the people. Isn't that incredible? There have been insects around. The oldest fossil is 400 million years old. They were here 170 million years before the dinosaurs. So enormous amount of insects, very varied, absolutely incredible things. They all come pretty much the same design, 6 legs, sort of 3 body parts, head, thorax, abdomen, but very differently put together. So they look quite different. So why do we need them? I mean, you look out, they're sort of buzzing around, minding their own business in the garden. And you might think, well, actually, they're just a nuisance because, you know, you get the gnats and you get the wasps and things that you don't really like very much, aphids eating your plants. But we need them. Wonderful quotation from the Harvard professor, E.O. Wilson, who is an entomologist. He's an ant specialist. And he says, we need invertebrates, but they don't need us. If human beings were to disappear tomorrow, the world would go on with very little change. But if invertebrates were to disappear, I doubt that human species would live more than a few months. If they disappeared, terrestrial and freshwater habitats, ecosystems would collapse, and that would have a profound impact on human well-being. About 3/4 of the crops grown by humans need pollination by insects. The only ones that don't are the grains. So think how boring your diet would be if we didn't have insects to pollinate crops. You'd have rice, wheat, this sort of thing. No vegetables, no fruit, no bunches of grapes, no strawberries, no asparagus, nothing like that. So let's have a look at a few of the pollinators. Obviously, there's the bees, there's the honeybees, bumblebees, carder bee down here on the bottom right, but also the hoverflies, the moths, the butterflies, beetles of various sorts, drone flies, all sorts of things act as pollinators for flowers and for crops. There is enough concern about the decline in bees that in America and in China, they're actually making robotic bees. Really, a robotic bee, why on earth do we need it? There's about 3.2 trillion honeybees, hive bees, running around the planet, pollinating things for us. If each robot bee, here is one, if it only costs a penny to make, and that's without development and everything, it would cost £32 billion to have our pollination done by these little robots, and we'd get no honey. There's all the carbon footprint of making them. It looks quite plasticky to me. There's a lot of plastics in there. There's the power source. There's the pollution caused by, they're bound to fail. Eventually the power source, they're going to fall to the earth. They're going to pollute things by having all those little bits of power source and things lying around. And let's face it, do we need them? Can't we spend all that money they're using to develop these things on looking after the real bees? What else do they do apart from pollinating? Well, they're the recyclers. They decompose things. So these are sexton beetles, and they get rid of dead creatures. Their larvae feed on decomposing flesh. If we didn't have these things, dead things would, and obviously the blowflies and things, dead things would lie about all over the place. We've also got the ones that decompose the dung, particularly farming areas. Without these little fellas, we'd be up to our necks in it. You think about how much dung a herd of cows produces. These dung beetles of various sorts, all sorts of other insects, break it down for us. There's an interesting thing about in Australia. Obviously, the dung beetles there evolved with the marsupials, the creatures of arid countries, and they just couldn't deal with cowpats, too wet for them. So the Australians actually had to import dung beetles. And between 1969 and 1982, they imported several sorts of dung beetle, including, we don't get these ones here that make the nice round balls like the scarabs, but these are the sort of things they were bringing into Australia to deal just with the cowpats. Before they brought them in, the Australian barbecues and everything were plagued by masses of bush flies that were breeding in the dung and causing a terrible nuisance. So this was an introduction of something to recycle the cowpats. They decompose dead wood. These are stag beetle and the stag beetle larvae. A lot of beetles lay their eggs in wood, and the larvae munch through it, make it a suitable place for fungi and molds to grow, which also act to decompose it. So breaking down the hard cellulose of wood, lignin, to put it back into the environment. These are things that are all recycling all the nutrients that are bound up in living things back into the environment. Even the little tiny ones. This is the only non-insect I've put in. This is a woodlouse. They're arthropods, but they're not insects. They've got lots of legs. But it's the only one in the show, I promise you. The other little fellas are springtail. And these are tiny little things that live in leaf litter and compost. And they're all very important for breaking down all that plant matter. Everything that dies gets recycled and sent back into the earth as nutrients. Without these little insects that are doing it, everything would just pile up and pile up and pile up. They're predators. Lots of insects are predators. All the dragonflies and damselflies, hornets and wasps, ants, ladybirds, they're all eating other insects that could be a pest to us. Ground beetles, very important for munching their way through pest insects, small slugs, this sort of thing. And the earwigs, also predatorial. Basically, if it moves fast, if it's an insect that goes about fast, it's a predator. And if it goes slowly, it's a detritus, or it eats decomposing stuff, or it's a vegetarian. So in your garden, anything that's going fast is probably a good thing to have. They're also food for some of our much loved wildlife. The lovely songbirds, a lot of the migrant species particularly are all insectivores, the little warblers, the chiffchaff here on the top left, pied flycatchers, whitethroats, wagtails, all rely on insects as a food source. Even some of the ones you think you consider to be grain eaters need insects while they're feeding their young, because the chicks can't eat grain and they're fed on tiny caterpillars and things. So without the insects, we'd have no birds. We'd have no bats. Bats also, huge amounts of insects get munched up by bats, all little gnats and flying things at night. So totally important as a prey source for some of our favorite creatures. Are they really declining? It's very hard to tell. All the time I was researching this, everywhere I read was, we don't know. We just don't know. About all sorts of different aspects of it. There's a problem with perception, the shifting baseline. We remember what it was like when we were children. We can't remember what it was like 100 years ago. So insect decline is a bit difficult. I remember walking through fields full of grasshoppers. They're hopping out everywhere and chirping, and these are both meadow grasshoppers. They come in a pink form as well, which is really rather attractive. Crickets. This is a wart biter cricket. Hardly see them now. Glowworms. I haven't seen a glowworm in years. They used to be quite frequent. They're actually kind of beetle. Really lovely things to see on a summer evening. But we don't know how many there were. We don't know how many have gone. We miss them. We look out and we go, well, I'm sure I can remember when the buddleia bushes were absolutely covered in butterflies, and now there's maybe 3 or 4, 5 or 6, but not the great flocks of them there used to be. It's quite tricky because really the only species we've got proper records for are the more obvious ones, the butterflies, the moths. Bees, we have records of distribution, but not of actual numbers. And a lot of the records of these, of different kinds of insects, the more obscure insects, tend to record more like where the entomologists are rather than where the insects are. Because if you've got somebody who's terribly keen on, shall we say, crane flies, you get, he's out there looking for crane flies, he's getting excited about a new species, or he's recording a new species of it in this place. But if nobody in the next county is the slightest bit bothered about crane flies, we're going to have no records there at all. So, it's showing us the distribution of entomologists rather than the distribution of insects. Insect abundance, though, is declining. We might have lost 50% or more of our insects just since 1970. It could be much more. The figures just aren't available for most of them. Local extinction of insect species is 8 times faster than that of vertebrates. On average, insects are declining by 2.5% every year. 41% of insect species threatened by extinction. There's a wonderful quotation from Paul Ehrlich, who says, "The loss of species is like the piecemeal disassembly of an aeroplane. You can go on removing some of the tiniest components, rivets from the wings, say. For a while, it still goes on flying. One day, however, you'll remove one too many, and the whole thing will crash." The overall biomass of insects, how many there are all put together, fell by 75% in the 26-year period from 1989 to 2014 in a study of 63 nature reserves in Germany. This is the nature reserves. They use malaise traps. These are the sort of tent traps that collect any flying insect. It's just the tail end of a much larger fall. Because we don't know how many there were 100 years ago, before pesticides and industrial farming, we just don't know how many we've lost. Huge impact on other species. The insectivorous birds, these are particularly the ones that are taking insects in the air, have massive declines in them. That group of birds has fallen by more than any other bird group in North America. They lost 40% of them between 1966 and 2013. In this country, we can notice the drop in spotted flycatchers. These are predators, spend all the time catching flying insects. They don't really hunt anywhere else. 93% gone between 1967 and 2016. Partridges, grey partridges are down, nightingales are down, and the cuckoos, which are specialist feeders on those really big, fat, hairy caterpillars, down by 77%. So, huge impact on insectivorous species. Marvellous little bird, the red-backed shrike. These are extinct as a breeding species in the UK since the 1990s. They're the ones, they specialise on really big insects, and they make these fabulous larders, impaling them on thorns. Spectacular little birds, and we just haven't got them anymore. And we notice that we haven't got the birds, but we don't notice that we've lost a lot of the insects. They've just been quietly tidied away, swept under the carpet. Nobody knows where they've gone. Well, we know where they've gone, they've died, but it's very easy to overlook such small creatures. This is a worldwide thing. This isn't just in industrialized developed countries. There's very little solid evidence, but there was a recently published study from the Puerto Rican rainforest, and they did sweep net and sticky trap surveys, which are fairly standard for insects, between 1976 and 1977, and it was repeated between 2011 and 2013. And in that time, the biomass had fallen between 75 and 88% for the sweep net surveys, and 97 and 98% for the sticky traps. Identical sticky traps in 1977 and 2013. The catch declined from 470 arthropods, insects, bugs, per day to just 8 milligrams. 470 to 8. It's a hell of a loss. So what's causing it? Obviously, habitat loss and fragmentation. Fragmentation is very important. What have we lost in the countryside that is causing this decline in insects? Since 1950, we've destroyed 98% of our wildflower meadows. These are really important for pollinators. Absolutely buzzing, wonderful habitat. 50% of ancient woodlands. A lot of the beetle species need old, decaying trees of the kind you get in ancient woodlands. You just don't get them in parkland, you don't get them on farms, they get tidied up. We lost all that. 60% of the lowland heaths. 80% of downland sheepwalk. Most of our lowland fens and mires. Hundreds of traditional oak trees. These are all really valuable habitats for insects. With enough hedgerow to stretch to the moon. Farm ponds, water meadows, riverside habitats, and the traditional farm practices that encouraged insects to thrive on farmland. Most importantly, we've lost the networks in the landscape. Creatures can't move about without a network of habitats that they can move from one to the other. Agricultural intensification. This is the one that everybody notices, everybody shouts about. Don't blame the farmers. It's not their fault. The industrial chemical-based farming system was brought about by government policies, subsidies, regulations, with drivers including the need to feed a growing population, particularly after the last World War. There was a lot of concern about food security. Consumer preference, people expecting their food to be beautiful, their fruits and vegetables to be without blemish. Growing power of the big supermarket chains, demanding even-sized, even-shaped, unblemished fruit and vegetables. Marketing pressure from the agrochemical industry. It's a huge industry. A lot of it developed after advances made in chemistry in the last World War. And basically they turned after that to making pesticides. Pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, molluscicides, fungicides, these sort of things. Huge amount used on farms every year. The NFU refers to these things, insecticides and fungicides and herbicides, plant protection products. They don't call them pesticides. On the other hand, if he needs all this protective gear, do you really want it on your food? You've got a choice. Buy organic. Buy stuff that doesn't look immaculate. A lot of the latest angst about it has been brought about by the neonicotinoid insecticides. These were banned in 2018, but they can be licensed for emergency use. These are systemic insecticides. They get into all parts of the plant. So they're getting into the pollen. They kill bees incredibly easily, highly toxic in minute quantities. 1 teaspoon of the stuff is enough to kill 1.25 billion honeybees. That's 4 lorry loads of honeybees. The trouble is the testing of insecticides tends to be on single insecticides, and what they're putting on the fields is an absolute cocktail of them. So the tests perhaps aren't adequate, really, to show the real problems that these things can cause. It's getting into our food. Even if we're not worried about the insects, be worried about the fact it's getting into our food. 75% of honey samples from around the world contain neonicotinoid insecticide. You don't want to be eating this stuff, you really don't. It's just been licensed as an emergency measure to combat beet yellows virus. This is a sugar beet crop. Perhaps not the most essential crop, but sugar beet is a bit prone to all sorts of nasty things, and this is one of them. And the license has been given for them to use it as a seed dressing. Emergency licensing lasts 3 years. After that, they can ask for another emergency. Seed dressing is actually not very efficient. Only 5% of it goes where it's targeted, into the crop. The rest of it accumulates in the soil, and it can be absorbed by the roots of wildflowers and hedgerow plants and all sorts of things. It can also leach into rivers and streams, and it can harm over 3,800 invertebrate species in the rivers and streams, all damaged by this. And it's only through campaigning by the National Farmers Union, the NFU, that these things get reversed, get relicensed. The NFU has just over 50,000 members. If you put together all the members of the RSPB and the Wildlife Trusts, 1,850,000 of us. But still the NFU can push to have this sprayed on our fields, sprayed on our food. But it's not just agricultural. Parks, farms, streets all get treated with stuff to kill weeds, to kill insects. This non-agricultural use of pesticides is purely cosmetic. It's unnecessary. Plenty of ways to deal with weeds apart from spraying them with herbicides. You can use a hot foam treatment, which basically clings to the weeds and cooks them and kills them. Much better way of doing it, rather than having parks, verges covered in herbicides and insecticides. Non-native invasive species can have an impact. These are Harlequin Ladybirds, and they were used as a control on aphids in greenhouses in Europe. They did it very well, but of course some of them escaped. They're much bigger than our native ladybirds and very variable. They tend to hibernate in these aggregations, large colonies, and you can just see the variation within the species is huge. The trouble is they ate all the, they escape. Once they've run out of aphids and things to eat, they start eating the ladybirds, the native ladybirds. So yeah, bad things. Invasive plants, Himalayan balsam. I mean, you think the bees actually love it, but it can outcompete the native flora and take over pretty much, particularly riverbanks. You get huge amounts of this sort of thing. And also things like knotweed, huge stands of it, basically stopping anything else growing there. So non-native invasive species, particularly in freshwater environments, are another bad thing for the insects. Light pollution. We only really think about it when we go out and try and, just want to go out and look at the stars, or there's a particular event we want to see. There's there's a comet going past or something. We think, wouldn't it be nice if the sky was darker? Most of the time we don't really think about it, but of course insects do. Moths are particularly attracted to light. It's a great way of finding them. You put a good light up, you'll get lots of moths coming to it, but they exhaust themselves flying round and round lights all the time, especially in cities. There's evidence that city moths are becoming much more sedentary because basically they're tired of flying round and round. glowworms are put off by it. It interferes with their breeding, it interferes with their life. And then finally, of course, there's climate change. So it's also impacting on insects, particularly on the ones that here are really at the edge of their environmental tolerance. And a change in climate means that they have to, they're trying to move somewhere cooler perhaps, and really the only place they can go up mountains maybe, but there might not be the plants they need to live there. So climate change also having an impact, but all the other stuff is far more important, and we can do something about it. It's not impossible. We haven't lost these forever. They're fast breeding, they're quick moving. So what can we do? We don't want to lose our bees. We don't want to lose our insects. What can we do? Stop the routine and unnecessary use of pesticides. Prophylactic use of pesticides, putting them on just in case a pest should come along. Build a robust nature recovery network. Look into the greening of our towns and cities, all those road verges and canal banks, parks, gardens. France has introduced national legislation banning non-agricultural use of pesticides from 2020. It has 900 of these pesticide towns without pesticides, including Paris. If the French can do it, why can't we? A bit of local action. Lots of very inspiring local initiatives going on through the country. The one near Stirling is the On the Verge project, and they've actually adopted bits of verge. They're sown with wildflowers. They're not getting cut. They're really good for insects. Planning in the built environment. The Wildlife Trust pressurizes local government to insist on green space being included with new building development. We work with developers to make sure that happens. We need to protect and enhance and link up the wildlife hotspots. These are the reserves, these are the local nature reserves, SSSIs, national nature reserves, and they need to be looked after so that there's a core of insects there to move out into these green spaces we're going to be creating in the towns and gardens. Shropshire Wildlife Trust, we're working with schools to make sure their school grounds are greened and good for insects, but of course good for the children as well, because if they've got all that life going on, they've got outdoor learning opportunities, they've got a good environment to be in, a good healthy environment to be in, and the insects are important for that. Government action is important. We need the government to take this on board properly, and to persuade them to do it, we need all of you out there to shout at them a bit, because they won't do it on their own. They need to legislate on pesticide use. They need to uphold the current bans. They need a commitment to the nature recovery networks, reforms to agricultural subsidies. The current subsystem supports agribusiness rather than farmers, consumers, and wildlife. We need to design and implement policies to encourage productive and ecologically sustainable farming. The current food and farming system is hugely inefficient. About a third of the food produced goes to waste. Far too much space is used growing crops to feed livestock, and they're spraying pesticides just in case. So this needs to be got away with. In some cases, crops will actually do better without the pesticides. If you spray out all the ground beetles, one thing that the neonicotinoids doesn't bother is slugs. If you get rid of all the ground beetles, you then get a huge amount of slugs thriving happily because they've got no predators. So, yeah, they need to reform the system. Free advice to the farmers, financial incentives for them to do integrated pest management, so they're only using pesticides when they need to. We need a robust Environment Act with legally binding targets and an independent watchdog to make sure it really happens. Local action, though, much more exciting. You can get involved in this. Obviously, with the government, all you can do is shout at them a bit. But local action, you can get involved. Local pressure groups can influence pet councils. How they treat the verges and the roundabouts and the canal towpaths and things can be enormously affected by what the local people want. You need to make your voice heard. Monitoring schemes. If we don't know where the important places are, we can't put the pressure on to have them protected. We can't do the right things. So get involved with monitoring. Greening movements, adopting verges and roundabouts and these sort of things. Do some guerrilla gardening, flower bombing. Wildlife-friendly churchyards make a really good space for wildlife, particularly the insects. And things you can do on your own. Lobbying. Do make sure you sign our petitions about the use of neonicotinoids, because the more of us that lobby, the more effect it'll have. One or two people isn't going to have an effect if lots and lots of us do it well. Citizen science. You can record the insects in your garden. There's plenty of schemes you can get involved with. I've just signed up to something called Buzz Club, which is fabulous. Lots of little experiments and projects you can do in your own garden to help insects. And of course, your garden is a very valuable place for insects. It's a valuable place for you because it's your bit of your bit of nature. Over 10 million acres of gardens in the UK, which is more than all of the nature reserves put together. So there's some simple things you can do. You don't have to make an enormous change, and you don't have to turn your garden into a wilderness. But you can ban pesticides. In your own space, you don't have to use anything like that. And start there and then move out to your community. Because once your garden's looking lovely without them, you can talk to your neighbours about it. You can get them involved. You can get them doing the same. And before you know what, you'll have a whole street of people not using any pesticides. You don't need them. If you've got a good, varied insect biomass, they'll take care of themselves. So if you've got aphids, you'll have ladybirds, you'll have lacewings, all troughing up the aphids. So hold your nerve. Don't reach for that spray bottle. If your lawn is looking a bit patchy and brown because you've got a lot of leather jackets in it, just enjoy the starlings. They'll come and eat them. They'll love them. And because they hatch out into crane flies, so they're food for all sorts of those birds that need the flying insects that we were talking about earlier. So just, like I say, hold your nerve. Don't worry. Eventually, the balance will come back. Cockchafer grubs, eating your bean roots and things. Yeah, you're going to get a bit annoyed. You might lose a bean or two, but without cockchafer grubs, you haven't got any cockchafers. And these are the most fabulous sort of fat, buzzing beetles that fly around the place. The males have these incredible antennae with the sort of feathers on them. And I just love them. I think they're absolutely great. So what are we going to do to encourage them? Lots and lots and lots of flowering plants. Okay, we're not going to have borders like this. This is the Oxford University Botanical Garden. But it just shows you loads and loads of plants together. They'll look fabulous, and there'll be absolutely huge amount of food for all those pollinators. And to be honest, in that lot, you're not going to notice a few aphids and things. There's going to be all sorts of insects having an absolute ball in a flower bed like that. Let your garden go a bit wild. It doesn't have to be all of it. It doesn't have to look untidy, but just a bit of, leave some of the lawn uncut. Leave a few weeds between the paving. It'll all encourage wildlife. It'll encourage insects. And of course, if you've got a lot of insects, you'll have a lot of other wildlife too. You'll have the birds, you'll have the hedgehogs maybe, all sorts of things coming into your garden. This is a sort of local initiative in Oswestry that the community, the community this is in the centre of, had small, very small gardens, but they had open space that the council mowed regularly, and they said they didn't want it, and they planted flowers instead. So now they've got these wonderful areas of beautiful flowering space, which is absolutely buzzing with life. And not only are the insects loving it, but the people are too. It's giving them joy looking at the plants and also looking at hearing the insects. So yeah, a bit of your lawn could look like that. Doesn't have to be just a flower bed. It's very important to have a long flowering season. These are a lungwort relative. They're out in my garden at the moment. They've been out for a few weeks now. Fabulous food for pollinators. Willow trees are brilliant, but you don't have to have a huge one. This is a goat willow called Kilmarnock, and it's a very small tree, but it's absolutely covered in flowers that the bees love. And some ivy. Ivy flowers very, very late, has lots of pollen, and will be an absolute magnet for bees. These really good bee plants, the ivies and the goat willows and things, you can hear them before you see them. You can hear there's a wonderful buzz going on, and it's bringing life to your garden. It's not a sterile backdrop. It's got life there. It's all moving around. It's brilliant. Deciding what sort of flowers you want. Have lots of variety, obviously, lots of shapes, but go for the simpler ones. Catnip here. This is a giant, on the top left is a giant hyssop on the bottom right. Plume thistle there on the bottom left, and a single peony. Now, most of the peonies you'll see with these big, loads of petals on them, big double peonies. And the bees can't get at them. They don't have a lot of nectar, and what nectar there is, the insects can't get to. So go for these simple open flowers. They'll look just good, and the insects will thank you. The bees particularly will love them. Ponds are particularly good for insects. And most of the time, through most of this, I've been talking about not about aquatic insects, but of course, a lot of insects can start life in water and then come out and be aerial afterwards. So things like caddisflies, dragonflies, damselflies, mayflies all start life in water. So a garden pond could help to replace all those farm ponds we've lost. All of the village ponds used to be one in every farm, at least one on every farm, one in every village, because they were needed for the horses to drink at, for the cattle to drink at. And after the working horses were got rid of and tractors brought in, they didn't need them. So now we've got galvanized cattle drinkers and no ponds. So garden ponds can be really, really vital for breeding places for some of these flying insects. So if you haven't got one, build one, dig one, even a tiny one. makes a huge difference. Without that sort of, if we haven't got fresh water, we're not going to have any dragonflies. And imagine missing that. Compost heaps are brilliant. They're absolutely full of insects munching their way through your kitchen scraps and your weeded bits and your leaf molds and things. Absolutely heaving with insects. And gives you wonderful compost to use as mulches around your garden and save you having to buy bags of compost that are destroying the peat bogs. So good compost heap is an essential part of any wildlife garden. Log piles are great for insects. Think of all those the beetles that their larvae need to live on decaying wood. Build a nice log pile. You could tuck it away somewhere and leave it. Don't use it for putting on your wood burner or anything. Just leave a nice log pile. Everything will live in it. You can build insect hotels. These are great fun for children. This is one that we made on one of the corporate events, and it's got a planter on the top that you can grow small plants in, and it's stuffed with all sorts of different things that will offer somewhere for insects to hibernate or to live. It's big. It might not be quite what you want in your garden, but you can get smaller ones. You can make smaller ones. This one's spaces for things like ladybirds and lacewings and for solitary bees. The solitary bee boxes, very popular. A lot of them don't. Bumblebee boxes really don't work very well, I don't think. I've never had any luck with them. But these, you do get the mason bees using them. This one's specifically designed for mason bees, and it has cardboard tubes in it that have a paper lining, and you can actually replace the tubes as they get used up and dirty. You can buy a new set and pop them in. So this is one of the cheaper, easier, and actually more efficient options for these things. But you don't even need to go to that expense. I've found that a bundle of cut bamboo cane, as long as they've got a nice hole in them, they use those. You could drill holes in a block of wood or a log, or maybe even your fence. About an 8mm hole is all they need. No bigger than that. They want to be fairly snug. And this is for the solitary mason bees. They're great pollinators. They're out early, and the kids will love watching them. We all need to play a part in this. We want to get everybody involved. We want to get the youngsters involved. They're still in their bug phase. Give them something to watch. Give them something to get inspired by. This is an emerging mason bee, and it's not actually in a specific bee box or anything. This one was in a bamboo pole that was supporting part of one of those temporary vegetable beds. And it's basically it's a kind of plastic bag thing, and you shove bamboo poles in a pocket on each side of it to hold it rigid. And I put one of these out, and the mason bees went in it, and this is one of them coming out of its nest chamber. You can see the sort of plaster work, the mud that the bee has blocked up the tunnel with before, after it's laid its eggs and things. And this one's just hatching out and emerging. So this is why they're mason bees, because they're not because they destroy your masonry, but because they plaster up the compartments of the egg chambers. So this one is just emerging as a new life, a new bee for the garden. And I mean, how can you resist that? You've got to have one, really, haven't you? Everybody needs to play a part. We all need to get onto this insect decline thing seriously. We need to lobby. We need to get involved in local action. We want to make our spaces, our own spaces, our garden spaces, wildlife friendly, and encourage everybody else to do it as well. It's absolutely vital. Remember, if we lose our insects, we're not going to last much longer without them. So get involved, do your bit in your garden, and as usual, join the Wildlife Trust. We're looking after those vital hubs that can repopulate and replace all those insects that we're losing. So the more members we have, the louder we can shout, the more voices we've got. We need to be able to shout loudly. We need to make government, local government, national government listen. So join us. We can shout louder if you do. Thank you very much.